Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Special District Summit East. I'm Dustin Heisler. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for Government Technology Magazine, and I'll be your host for today's summit. Just want to thank you all for joining us. We've got a lot of stories, best practices, and lessons learned to share with you today. But just a few quick housekeeping notes before we dive into the discussion. You may have noticed that all your microphones and video have been turned off by default. However, you can use the chat function to communicate with your fellow attendees. We would love to hear from you and what best practices you have, what challenges you have, and what learnings you have. We may even call some of them out as the day progresses. For those of you that have questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible today, but if for some reason we're unable to get to your question, don't worry. We'll follow up post-event with an answer. For those of you that have been part of our Special Districts program, welcome back. For those of you that are new, welcome to the largest national program for the over 38,000 special district agencies across the country. This program was created in joint partnership with Government Technology and AT&T to educate, to inspire, and to recognize special district innovations throughout the country. You can learn more about the program on the URL on the screen, govtech.com/districts. Make sure you plug into all of our upcoming events, research, and news. Now, normally we would be with you in person, but this year, unfortunately, we've had to take all of our programming virtual over the past few months. We've hosted a number of virtual events to help special districts navigate COVID-19. We even launched a resources section on the Special District Program site that aggregates policy templates and other helpful guidance for you. Now, today's event is focused on the Eastern United States. So many of you will see your peer districts from Florida, Georgia, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and many more states from the Eastern US. And although COVID-19 has certainly challenged the country, it's also activated many of your own districts, not just to respond to crisis, but to triumph over crisis, to rapidly adapt and even come up with new models for funding and service delivery. Now, today's theme is around navigating the uncertainty of 2020 and preparing for what's next. Let's take a quick look at some of the inspirations that we've seen from special districts across the country. Number one, special districts are rapidly responding to change and are finding all kinds of new leadership models. Some of those we're going to dive into today as it relates to addressing this new normal, this next normal, this new reality that we're in. We're also seeing a lot of special districts going virtual, and it's not just having your staff work remotely and using new technology, but also taking services and taking things like Zumba and making those virtual and accessible to employees and to constituents that you serve. We've also seen a lot of special districts that have launched new digital innovations and have found new connectivity initiatives, have even created virtual hotspots and checkout programs through their libraries, e-signature, all kinds of new innovations that have been happening across the country. And we've seen special districts test new models for delivery and funding. We all know this is a fiscally constrained environment, so it's been so inspiring to see how special districts have innovated around the constraints that we have to find better ways of doing things. Now, there's still challenges that exist, and what's on the screen right now, from beta burdens to, trying to lay some of the foundational elements of new technology, new business processes, to even the reskilling of employees. We're going to dive into that. We're going to look at ways to hack your system, to hack around that and find better ways of doing things. So let's talk about what we have in store for today. Well, we're going to start first with talking about what we've learned, and we're going to bring in some experts to break down how they responded to the situations of 2020 and have really triumphed over that. Then we're going to talk about the future of leadership and a new model of leadership and management. We're going to talk about adapting your operations for this new reality, and then how to reimagine the special district experience and how you serve not just your employees, but the public. And then we'll close with a look around the corner of what you can expect going forward into 2021. Now it's time for our first panel where we're going to talk about what we've learned. And here to help us break it down are Robert Hicks, the Chief Operating Officer for the Delaware River Port Authority, Kingman Schuldt, the Fire Chief for the Greater Naples Fire Rescue District, and Michael Harrod, Principal Architect of Shared Solutions for AT&T. Now, before we dive into our panel discussion today, we're going to also ask you a quick poll question around what your greatest challenges are today and how you're responding to COVID. So you'll see a poll question come across your screen. We'd love to hear from you. And here we go. So your greatest challenges: impact of revenues and expenditures, cultural changes, governance, technology access. As you're answering that, we'll let our panel join us on video. So Michael Robert Kingman, thanks so much for carving some time out and joining us for today's discussion as we break down what we've learned from the events of this year. As our audience is answering this question, let's just dive into the discussion. And Robert, let's start with you. First, tell us a little bit about how COVID-19 impacted your special district. How disruptive was it to your operations? And where are you at today in response?
Well, it was extremely disruptive. For those of you who don't know anything about my authority, we're actually a bi-state authority that's located in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. We're governed by two states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So a lot of what we had to do, we had to follow the direction of the two governors. Of course, we were an agency that never used teleworking before. So obviously we're using it every day like everybody else is. It's probably doubled the amount of work that all of us have had to do at every level of management in my organization. We have daily executive meetings, daily director meetings that never existed before. It's really increased our cross-boundary, cross-functional leadership across the organization. We now have a task force, which I'll probably dive into a little bit later, that has had 11 subcommittees that focus on different areas of COVID-19 response. We're an authority that runs, we're like a toll agency, and we have a transit system. So for a significant period of time, we pulled our toll collectors out of the booths, like a lot of our neighboring toll authorities did. And until we learned about how disruptive or how dangerous COVID was, we did that. Our transit system, we significantly reduced our transit schedules. So after about a month and a half of pulling toll collectors out, we actually had plexiglass in the windows. They had gloves. They were mandated to wear masks. They had hand washing protocols. Our transit system, we had really extensive cleaning protocols. We made it mandatory after a certain period of time for passengers to wear masks. We doing a lot of other things. So, I mean, there's a lot that we've done. The last thing I'll mention is construction. We were not able to do construction on our major bridges or our transit system for a while until the approval of both governors. But after a while, they gave that approval, and we were trying to expedite those projects, taking advantage of the reduced level of traffic on those bridges. So that's some of what we're doing, and some of how it was disruptive for us.
Yeah, so you've been pretty busy, and Kingman, I'd love to kind of get your perspective on this as well. I mean, you're kind of in an interesting spot as a fire district. So tell us a little bit about how COVID impacted your operations.
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, our whole business model is built on a customer service or responses to requests for assistance. So, the fire service, we're very adept to receiving a call for a medical emergency or a fire and responding out and dealing with that, we'll say, in a very short period of time. And then, we have typically planned for those larger events like hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes, but those are defined events. And we're really good at going out and responding to a hurricane and work for a 7 to 20 day period, and we kind of close the book and move on. Well, how it's affected us is now now we're into 8-9 months of this, that we are experiencing today about a 15% increase in emergency calls or requests for assistance. So for us, we've had to turn in from dealing with the acute emergency to a long-term pandemic emergency. So we've had to change our business model for a sustainment plan to be able to respond to these events. So that's been quite a bit different for us. It's also affected, our ability in our business models. As many government agencies, we were not fully functional to work remote. So we've had to go through many of the same similar adaptations or augmentations to our processes to allow us to work remotely. But that increase in call volume or incident volume for us was very significant. And we had to retool ourselves in how we would respond to these emergencies. As you can imagine, for a COVID response, we're listening to these ideas and how to put up plexiglass and hand cleaning and all of that. Well, we need to get to the tip of the spear of when somebody calls 911 because they're having difficulty breathing. So we've had to change our deployment model of putting a different number of resources on these emergencies to limit that exposure from the very beginning. So it's been quite a challenge for us. We are in it for the long haul, and we experience, again, the very similar business operational changes that many of the others. But today, where we found ourselves is we've had to cut programs to make sure we have proper funding for proper personal protective equipment and increase call volumes. And, we've had to obviously put a considerable amount of funding towards the purchase of hardware so we can work remotely like many other businesses. But I think that emergency call volume situation for us is what makes us a little more unique. And that's the biggest challenge for us throughout this marathon pandemic.
Yeah, I know we're going to dig into that in a second, but I want to bring Michael in too, and also share the results from our audience with what your greatest operational challenges are today. And it looks like the impact of revenues and expenses, kind of what Kingman was talking about as well, are the greatest challenge. But it's kind of split across the board as you get down into cultural dynamics and access to technology. So, Michael, what are you seeing here nationally as you work with special districts around the country? What types of commonalities are you seeing in their challenges and their approaches to response?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been the ability to pivot and provide the resources, the connectivity, the equipment, all of that to get people connected remotely or from wherever they're moving from. And the best example is talking about what the chief did. In a number of our instances with 911 centers, they wanted to reduce staff members that are in there, specifically supervisors and those sorts of things, not the call takers, and moving those individuals out and moving them into remote locations. So we had to pivot to that and look for solutions to be able to make that happen, but still being very effective on how they were responding and communicating. And going back to what Mr. Hicks was talking about, being able to adjust for that as well, moving the people out of the offices, getting them remote workers, providing that broadband or some kind of access, LTE type of access with MiFis or broadband initiatives. And it's been a huge push for the telecoms to be able to do that. And not only for our customers, but when you think about it as a company like AT&T in the size, we moved everybody out of our offices that were not essential to be able to do that. So it was a big pivot, not only for our company, but for the customers that we serve, and being able to pivot quickly to make that happen.
That's great. So Robert, I want to kind of dig into some of what you talked about as you opened kind of with your initial response. And you talked about, the need to create this task force and how you assembled a task force. And I'd love for you to maybe tell the audience a little bit about what you set up here and how it helped your district navigate this situation more effectively.
Yeah, it was interesting. Through the leadership of our CEO and deputy CEO, we were having these daily discussions about the different policies and procedures to create around COVID, and we decided we need to have something a lot more cohesive. So we decided to create a 13 subcommittee task force, which went across our entire organization. I'll just name some of the titles of some of these subcommittees. I mean, very detailed. We had a guiding principle subcommittee, phase return to work, physical distancing, buildings, facilities, fleet protocols, policy review, plan to follow employee when it presents or they must quarantine, feasibility of returning from work, technology committee communications, and I'll just stop there. But we've got like a 300-page plan right now that's been reviewed by KPMG and a couple other consultants. We've been working on it for probably the last 3 or 4 months. We'll be probably rolling it out officially to our employees in the next week or so, but that's been a pretty big help for us. I mean, we've looked at almost every detail possible out there. So.
Yeah, that's great. So Kingman, I want to get your perspective on this too. I mean, you talked a little bit also in your opening statement just around how you've had to play multiple roles. You've had an increase in calls for service. How do you balance the need to, respond to this never-ending crisis with, your other capabilities that you have to provide based on the type of district you are?
Yeah, it has been a challenge for us, and listening to both Robert and Michael, the challenges are very similar, but where we've had to kind of modify our priorities, and I don't want to take anything away from this. It's always a priority for us to make sure our employees are healthy and safe and, have a suitable work environment. But, the priority has changed to some degree that we are spending so much time and financial wherewithal, if you will, to make sure as we call it, we maintain healthy people and buildings, because, we have very limited number of people that can actually work remote. So, we have 100+ every day that must be here, riding fire trucks, going to medical calls, doing fire inspections, and we just cannot do some of those things remote. So that balance point is being able to maintain our regular level of service plus the increase of COVID while having a balance to make sure your people are comfortable at work, they feel safe, they feel like they're not going to become sick. So we've really spent a lot of time on that balance and implemented some additional programs. As you can imagine, with first responders, healthcare is very important for us in real time, but we've had to implement additional healthcare screening on a regular basis and spend the money to make sure that we can perform rapid COVID testing. Because if I have a firefighter or a station that is out on a 14 to 21 day quarantine, you can imagine my workforce, I can't balance of maintaining my regular response capabilities. So we've invested a lot of money. And I think the other balance point on that is the ability to collaborate with many other governmental agencies, not just special districts. I'm listening to some of the stories, and I had never in my career spent so much effort and time talking to our county's transportation department, if you will, 2 days a week on what they are doing and learning how that's even affecting the transportation of our citizens. So, but the most important thing is that balance point is those priorities is to, I think, make sure the people are healthy, clean, safe, and able to perform that function. And that's been quite an endeavor for us.
Yeah, and that seems to be an ongoing challenge, with a lot of districts today as they look at reopening and kind of bringing their staff back. So, Michael, I'd love to get your perspective here too. We've heard some challenges from Kingman and Robert. What are you seeing as common challenges? And, are you seeing any notable examples that districts have made, to overcome some of these challenges across the country?
It has, as all of us talk about, being able to provide the same amount or greater amount of service and care, given the resources that you're given in the communities and how to do that. In the chief's example, he has 100+ people employees that he can't have remote. So how do you account for that? How do you get the communications going and all of that? For Robert, and he has a lot of the toll booth workers, but then another large percentage of his employees that are working remote, and making them effective and being able to be effective and work like they are in the office and have the collaboration, have the tools, have the applications, have that same experience, but with all the disruption that can happen from working from home, because a lot of people don't have those spaces to be able to get away. So you have the doorbells ringing and the dogs barking and the kids running around and everybody kind of beating on you from all over. So how do you account for that and still provide to the chief's point, a good experience, a good work environment, and still be productive and effective at what you're doing? So it's about being able to provide the communications element of that, bringing all that in. Are we doing VPNs? Are we doing broadband? Are we doing MiFi? Do we have the ability to penetrate to the areas that you're going to? So it's been a huge investment in AT&T and being able to get those services out there and rolling that out rapidly to be able to account for that digital divide that exists.
So I want to get Robert and Kingman to kind of weigh in on this. I mean, when you think about the move to remote, not everything actually works in a remote or virtual setting. And I know we've had some conversations about this, but I'd love to hear from you, as special district leaders are trying to balance this new remote kind of norm and medium, what works and what doesn't work. Robert, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll start with that. As I said earlier, we're an organization that did not have a remote working policy at all. Only about 15 to 20% of our employees can probably even work remote. I mean, we have police officers, train operators, toll collectors, electricians, other types of mechanics that all work in our organization. So we have invested a lot more into technology, though, whether it's video cameras or laptops. There's been a big need and request for those types of devices. It's kind of forced us to work smarter and more efficiently. I attended a finance committee meeting of our authority this morning. We're going to lose something like $70 million by the end of the year because of the reduced tolls that we're going to collect. So it's kind of forced us to work a lot more efficiently. So Not sure they answered your question or not, but that's some of what's happening.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful for the audience to get some validation on some of the struggles that they have too. So Kingman, how about you? What's the balance here?
Yeah, well, let me start with what doesn't work for us. I find that we've seen a reduction in our ability to really provide effective human resource contacts with our people. You know, when you're not seeing people live, you lose that emotional touch. And our human resource manager, you know, she says it is a challenge. You know, there's times we need to be with the people, we need to meet with them to work through things. But that and the finance piece for us has been a little bit of a challenge because of our lack of secured infrastructure. So, but we're making headway in that area. But to manage our budget and process payroll, we find has been a little bit more of a challenge, I think. But the positives on this, you know, obviously, it's forced us to be more efficient as we conduct our meetings and operate. Of course, I think we all know we're being overwhelmed with these virtual meetings. So one thing we've learned is our senior staff is very adept to working remote and having these types of meetings, but we have found ourselves of having more meetings shorter because they're not in person and to keep the productivity moving along. One of the things that we also found out is our public board meetings. We are still under the option in Florida where you can meet virtually. And our board meetings have actually been very productive. I think maybe because there's less emotion maybe at times. So we found a good way to navigate through those. But I think one of the really positive wins in this thing is our life safety professionals, the ones that are out there in the community every day doing inspections, plans review, and interacting with people. You lose a piece when you can't meet with them, but our folks have really come up with a really effective virtual fire inspection platform that under certain circumstances, we're processing fire inspections through a virtual process. And that has been a significant win. We never would have even thought of doing that in the past. So those are a couple of the high and low points of this new virtual world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So Michael, a big question that I get asked all the time is, you know, a lot of districts provisioned a lot of new stuff, a lot of new technology, hotspots, connectivity, all kinds of things. You know, how are you seeing, or how would you advise agencies take some of that infrastructure and turn it into, you know, other things, repurpose it for kind of new use cases across the country? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
It is. So there's been a huge amount of capital expenditure on devices and access and all of that. What it allows the organizations to do, and exactly what the chief touched on, is look at new ways to provide operational efficiencies within the organization. Do we have to have everybody in brick and mortar locations, or can we find better efficiencies and use for that? And that has both its pros and cons going with it. But it really allows the organizations to take another look at how they're operating their business, be able to move quickly or quicker in relationship to what's going on within their organization, and really repurpose and retool of how they provide that communications, that access, that interaction with their workforce. Again, because when we talk about it, there are some benefits from being remote, but there's also downsides of it, and they all have to look at that and see what best fits their model. But they can repurpose a lot of the services and equipment that they have purchased in regards to how they run and operate their business.
Great advice. So Robert, I want to get your thoughts on, you know, looking at going back to work and returning to work and kind of normal operations. What are some elements that you're factoring into your thinking for going back?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned this cross-functional task force. One of the things this group created was something we're calling our phased reentry plan. The journey back to the workplace is actually like a 300-page plan that I mentioned earlier. That's what we have as our plan, what we're going to use for our organization. Right now, we're taking a very conservative approach. We're in the middle of our budget period right now, and we're taking a very conservative approach in terms of projecting what's going to happen. We're preparing, I guess, for a second wave. Just this morning, the newspapers here are saying that the rates of COVID-19 are going up in both states that I work with, Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So we have no idea when this is going to be over with, but we've got a plan in place. So when it does happen, we'll be ready.
That's great. And I agree. I mean, that's kind of all we can do. This is a disaster like no other disaster that doesn't have a finite end in mind. So looking to that future and the uncertainties ahead, let's kind of hear from each of you around, what specific elements or tactics do you think are critical for other special district leaders listening in today to better adapt and respond to what comes next? Kingman, let's start with you on this one.
I think my advice or statement on that would be collaboration. It's amazing what you can learn from your peers, your coworkers, to listen to Robert or Michael or anybody else that talks in their, in their little world. We're all doing the same thing, and that's providing customer service, and we're labor intensive, most of us. And I think that is the biggest benefit is again, and I mentioned this before, is that the ability to work with other people on a similar mission. And one thing I didn't mention before was the fact that we're working, very closely with law enforcement with all of the civil unrest and protests that have been going on through a COVID event. So they lean on us so much for how to deal with the COVID piece of it, and just things you never would have thought of with. And again, talking about transportation and utilities, I would really stress to everybody to collaborate with their peers that are in similar public services.
Well said. Michael, how about you? What are some specific elements or tactics you think leaders should take note of?
I echo what the chief said there with collaboration, and then it is taking a step and looking at the business model, understanding your people and resources. What is the best way to utilize all of that? And again, really have those conversations and understand what are some of the new models? How can we think and work outside of that box that we traditionally have been into?
Final word from you, Robert.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Collaboration, both within your organization, if it didn't exist before, and outside your organization. I think we've worked a lot vertically and horizontally with a lot of our regional partner agencies in our region, as well as, the different federal and other state agencies. So I would certainly agree with that.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Robert, Kingman, and Michael, for sharing your insights. That brings us to the close of our first panel for today. And now we're going to transition into our next panel to explore the future of leadership. Joining me today are Brian Benn, Chief Information Officer and Senior Vice President of the Atlanta Housing Authority, and former Chief Bruce Moeller, who's a former Chief of Staff and Assistant County Administrator for Pinellas County, Florida. And before we dive into the discussion, we'd also like to hear from you again about your greatest leadership challenges. So we're going to give you a quick opportunity to answer what your greatest leadership challenges are on the screen: managing remote employees, adapting culture, lack of available funding and resources, prioritizing initiatives. So select kind of what your greatest challenges are. And also, special thanks to Kim and to Marty for sharing, what they're doing and some of the unique challenges that they have in the chat. We encourage you to engage with the chat. One thing to note, when you chat, you'll want to make sure you hit the drop down to all panelists and attendees in order for everyone to see your insights and kind of what you're doing in response to these panels today. We'd love to hear, your lessons learned. And now let's share some of the results from this as we dive into the content. So it looks like prioritizing initiatives is one of the greatest leadership challenges today. We're seeing a lot of that when it comes to just, a finite amount of resources, but a lot of different things that you have to kind of balance. So thanks so much for sharing that with the group. So Brian and Bruce, thanks for joining. Brian, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about, kind of the impact that COVID-19 had on your district and its operations.
Well, it's definitely had an impact, and that's just maybe from a delivery of services standpoint. I mean, a lot of the stuff we do, we like to have a customer-centric, customer service approach. So, of course, that's kind of muted now from whether it's our intake process, our recertification process, even our inspections, and all these things that we do hands-on and face-to-face has changed definitely. And even from our resident and participant side, some of those participants have lost their jobs, and now they're having to combat that and having to pay, or we're having to try to be creative to make sure we're still covering their rent. So it's had an impact for us in our delivery and from them and their ability to maintain.
So now, kind of thinking about some of the challenges that we heard from the last panel and even from the audience themselves, what are some of the biggest challenges that you are facing today as a leader of a large special district?
Well, we just want to, in keeping with what I just said, we want to still ensure that customer-rich experience, but we want to do it now sensitive to our situation. We have to do it from a virtual paradigm. So we've got to come up with collaboration tools internally here. We have to make sure that externally we're bridging that digital divide so that the residents we serve have access to this new approach. So that's just, I guess, the biggest challenge, and just making sure that we're still able to achieve our goals while doing it within this new paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's right on. So Bruce, I want to bring you in because I know, when you were in government, you oversaw response and recovery initiatives for a number of different disasters. And, maybe I'd like to kind of get your perspective on how COVID-19 is similar or different. And is there anything that we can learn from some of these past events that have taken place that can be applied to what's going on today?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. There certainly is. So one of the main differences I make when you look at something like COVID or any sort of disaster crisis that strikes us is what's the focus of it? In other words, is it geographically distinct? Like maybe we'll have a tornado, an aircraft, a major aircraft crash, airliner crash, or even a localized, loss of power to critical infrastructure. You have to contrast that with something that has impacted the entire world. So that's what COVID has done. So as a worldwide event, the real challenge has to do with your resources, right? Because it means what you need to deal with this is what everybody needs to deal with this. And that's really one of the major challenges I think that's been in place here. So what that means obviously is things like building materials or heating fuel, other commodities are not the answer. In something like this, COVID, what we're really looking to do for many of us is to try to change the behavior, not just of our employees, but also of the communities and the citizens that we serve. But on the positive side, we're not in this event alone. So I think what you can learn from the past is the experience that we're having is similar to the experiences being had by special districts all over our region, all over the state, all over the nation. And so I think an opportunity exists, such as people taking it today. What are the other special districts doing? What lessons are being learned by them? And then to answer both that supply chain issue and understanding the lessons from others is we really need to, like the last panel said, like we've said already here, we need to engage our colleagues, understand what they're going through, share our experiences, but also look for common answers.
That's great. So Brian, I want to get your perspective on kind of this theme around the future of leadership and management. And, as Bruce talked about, there's a lot we can apply from the past, but how have you adapted the way that you lead and manage your team today in response to the uncertainties and the events that we had to deal with this year?
I think there just has to be, as leaders, I think it's incumbent upon us to have a heightened sensitivity to this new paradigm, a heightened sensitivity to the fact that some of our employees are now math teachers and reading instructors, and that they have kids that they may be having to help through their schoolwork. I've had a friend joke and said he sleeps on the couch to cut down his commute now. So it's just fundamentally changed. And even working remotely, you have to be sensitive, but you still want that production. So one of the things we use, and this is not mine, but we borrowed it, one mantra we have is to be available, do your job, and over communicate. And we think once that's in place, we think we can be successful in this pandemic. We also want to make sure we're using the tools at our disposal, and that's the EAP, the Employee Assistance Programs, and just making sure that we're aware. We're missing those conversations that we may have at the water cooler or when somebody walks into the office, but that doesn't mean we still don't have that personal touch, and we're aware of what our employees need and able to make them be successful, help them be successful.
Yeah, I love that. Be available, do your job, over communicate. I think that, was a critical lesson learned for a lot of districts. So appreciate you sharing that. So Bruce, I know that, you have a lot of perspectives about not just what leaders should do today, but I think one interesting facet of some of the things that we've talked about in the past is what they shouldn't do. And what can we learn from leadership failures of the past that can be applied today as well?
Yeah. So, there's been some great research on that, and it's looked at all sorts of different types of disasters and how organizations learn those lessons, or to be perfectly honest, how organizations don't learn those lessons from the past mistakes. And if you delve into it, there's really 5 common mistakes that are made by organizations when they are stressed by a crisis or a disaster, internal or external themselves. The first one is what I usually refer to as a failure of command. In other words, somebody has to be in charge. And while we all want to engage constituents and we want to sit there and have meetings and do, great amounts of planning, when it actually hits, somebody has to be in charge, somebody has to make decisions. You've got to move forward, okay? The failure of leadership, which is similar, is that whether or not you've prepared to take command, whether you've prepared the organization for what's coming. So that's really the first failure, a failure of leadership or command. You've got to be prepared, and then when it happens, you've got to be ready to act. Information sharing, data and information collection is really the second thing, communication. So one of the things that happens is while many of us have programs in place where we'll have performance measurement schemes, quality assurance, quality improvement, and all sorts of metrics coming in, where are you going to get your information for things that you never anticipated? Often this relies on you or causes you to rely on others, such as perhaps emergency management responsibilities in your community or in your county. Again, reaching out to professional organizations, associations to try to better understand what's happening. The third problem is resources. Have you got the supply chain? Have you got the resources available to allow you to address and mitigate what's happening? And of course, tied with these two, again, is planning, which is an essential component. Have you contemplated what are the risks that your organization could potentially face, and how will you address it when the time comes? So that planning process, especially if you can draw upon the expertise of emergency managers in your area and of your professional associations, can help mitigate that. And finally, the last one really is public information. We only have to look at what's happening today nationally. We only have to look what's happening today in our own communities or states to understand that communicating with the public has changed dramatically. It's not a 24-hour news cycle anymore. It's a second-by-second news cycle. You've got to be prepared to communicate with your constituents.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of double down on the strategy side of things, and Ryan, get your perspective on this, because I know that having a strategy is a critical aspect for special district leaders. It's a guiding, way to navigate uncertainty. Can you tell us a little bit about how the pandemic and the events of this year maybe impacted your district strategy and how you adapted?
Okay, well, the first thing we do, Dustin, is when we craft our strategy, we want to make sure of a couple things. We want to make sure that our strategy is anchored by the overarching strategy of the organization. It's useless, as good as the strategy we might have, it's useless if it's not supporting the goals and the vision of the organization as a whole. The other thing is we want to make sure our strategy is malleable, and there's a distinctive difference between the strategic and the tactical. So when the pandemic hit, or when anything hits, it may be a fundamental change in the industry and how your competitors operate. It may be a change in leadership. So the first thing we want to do is we want to assess the achievability and applicability of our strategy. Can we still achieve this? Is it still applicable now that we've had to deal with this change, whatever it was, pandemic, leadership change, what have you? And so once we've assessed that, then we can determine, okay, the strategy is still applicable, the strategy is still achievable. Now, how do we employ it by changing the tactical? So one of the major things we had was major initiatives is a customer service focused contact center. This contact center would take in hundreds of calls a day. When the pandemic hit, we can't staff that contact center any longer, but we still need to provide that service. So now what we did was we changed it to a virtual paradigm, work with partners, and set that contact center up remotely. So in that essence, the strategy stayed the same. The tactical and how we approached it changed.
That's great. And, I know that you've also, we had a conversation before this about digital transformation. And, oftentimes agencies have a strategy for trying to transform their operations. How are you approaching digital transformation in response to the chaotic times we're in?
Well, digital transformation means so much in so many different shops. For us, it's just a symbiotic relationship between people, processes, and technology. And while we're standing that up on our end internally, the big thing and the big focus that we're really excited about now is that we think that digital transformation should extend to our residents, 25,000 households and 60-some thousand participants. So to do that, we have an initiative called Access. It's a three-pronged approach. Access stands for Achieving Connectivity to Create Equity and Self-Sufficiency. And what we're doing in that approach is, our three-pronged approach is to make sure that we have hardware in the hands of our residents, all of our residents, whether that's tablets for our seniors, whether that's laptops for our school-age children. We just want to make sure that the hardware is there. The hardware is no good if we don't have that second prong, which is connectivity. We're partnering with ISPs. We're working with HUD to see if we can subsidize that and make sure we provide that connectivity. And meanwhile, we've provided connectivity in all of the common areas of our facility, our properties. But we have to make sure that bandwidth is enough. So we're looking for something a little more robust. And that third prong is literacy, digital literacy. And we've gone all the way from digital literacy for our seniors and even for our school-age children who are more IT savvy anyway. But the big thing that we have is we're establishing a cohort program for some of our demographic that wants to get into the workplace and we want to get them placed, workforce development, if you will. And that's specialized training such as cybersecurity, ServiceNow, Service Desk, Scrum training. So we've got a pretty robust program, and we're excited about a digital transformation that's not just happening internally, but externally.
So I want to bring in some chatter that's happening on the chat right now with our group. Marty started a great discussion around, in essence, their response in his district. They learned that some of the local residents still seem to think that everything's blown out of proportion, that it's a big hoax, and they're complaining that they paid for these services and demand everything to be open as normal. And Emily Shapiro, one of our board members for the Special Districts Program, kind of poses a great question, and that is, how do you keep up morale when everyone, including those you serve, are frustrated? And this kind of brings us to the culture question, right? How do you maintain a healthy agency culture in the midst of uncertainty and confusion and everything else? Bruce, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. So, this may sound crass or insensitive, but we call these things a disaster for a reason, right? Because they can really challenge the organization, not just the financial aspects, but the organizational aspects and the culture and the mental health of our people. So I think the answer to the question really is perspective, not just yours, but those within the organization and elsewhere. So I think what you need to do is you need to make time. First, you need to make time for yourself, but you also especially need to make time to help those within the organization, and not staff, not colleagues, the person. Are you taking the time to walk around your organization, those people that you deal with, those that you work for, those that work for you, your associates and professional colleagues elsewhere? Are you talking to them as a person, checking to see how they're doing, how their family's doing? Are you taking some time for the team to either break bread together or take a moment to talk about what's going on and to really kind of assess the organization's health? But we have to take a step back and put perspective on it. People are going to disagree. Good people are going to disagree on what's happening. I think the chat that you're talking about kind of reflects two things that were not all that unusual to most of us, right, that happen. And those of us that deal in public affairs, those of us that deal in government deal with it all the time. Keep it in perspective. There is a place to have your opinions, but as representatives of the government, as representatives of our organization, we have to help our people understand that taking the time to communicate with people one-on-one, to treat them as individuals and persons, respect their views, and ask only that they respect yours, and take the time to listen. I think that goes a long way.
Well said. So Brian, I'd like to get your perspective on this too. How do you maintain a healthy agency culture? How do you boost morale in the midst of all this uncertainty and different perspectives?
One of the things that I heard Bruce say that just makes so much sense to me is if you just got to listen. You've got to listen. You've got to step back. You've got to take time. And you've got to be sensitive to those around you. The other thing that we have to understand is we can only control what we can control. And we've got a lot of people around us that are a lot smarter than me that are specifically paid to address these issues, whether they're the scientists or what have you. So I don't sit and all of a sudden try to move from being a technologist to an MD. I know several MDs that have cropped up around me these days and several scientists and experts. So I just try to defer to the experts and then again control what we can control here. We've got a mantra, and it starts with listening, but we call it listen, learn, and then lead. So we listen to the experts, we listen to the people that have been affected, that have been most affected, and then we learn. We learn from their dynamic, we learn from their situation, and then we lead in an unselfish fashion as much as we can, and understand that we can only control what we can control, and this too will pass. Now, may be a fundamentally different world that we come out of. And there's some things that we can be excited about that we should focus on in terms of some of the good things. The carbon footprint has been reduced. Some people have gotten some hobbies. I've gotten a lot better at my grill game is so good right now. My omelets are round. I know how to flip them. They're egg white omelets. I'm trying to maintain my girlish figure. But there's some good things and some positive things. I spend a lot more time with my kids who are older now, and if they had food, money, and wireless, I wouldn't see them at all. So we get to so there's some good things that we get to focus on, and that's what it is for us.
So looking ahead to 2021, how should special district leaders be thinking about, leadership and management for the future, for the next pandemic, for the next wave? What are some things tactically that we should be thinking about as leaders? And Bruce, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah. So you asked me a question before about kind of the lessons learned or the lessons that we don't learn. So there's a couple things I think that you need to do to ensure that doesn't happen to you or to your organization. So obviously taking those lessons from the past, you've got to make sure as we're going through this crisis, you've got to make sure that you've got somebody who is documenting the challenges that your organization is encountering, how you responded to them, what actions were being taken, what plans were put in place. And then most important, were they effective? Did they accomplish what you wanted to do? Or if they didn't, if they're a failure, you got to call it a failure. You've got to say that didn't work. So brutal honesty, and I use the term brutal honesty in this process, is absolutely essential. But it's not just you, right? You've got to have this conversation. If you think, I like the metaphor of a compass. Those above us, those that we work for, whether it's our elected bodies or senior leadership, those that work in the organization that we're responsible for, our staff, our team, those in professional associations outside our organization, and our colleagues, if we have them at the same level within the organization. So you've got to talk to all four of those and get their input as well. And finally, I think the thing is that the best learning occurs in a group, right? So we all know that. And this is more difficult now with COVID, where all the conversations are virtual like this one. Draw on your professional relationships, those that you've made connections with in any of your organizations. And of course, those professional organizations are taking the time to develop a lot of lessons learned. Have the intellectual curiosity to ask others what worked for them and push them. What didn't work? Where did you stumble? I think that's really learning those lessons, documenting them, using them as a planning resource for the future. That's the key.
Brian, same question for you, thinking to 2021 and beyond, what should leaders be thinking about? What is on your mind as you kind of look at adapting the way that you lead and manage your team?
Well, I think the big thing that's been reiterated by this pandemic is that change is inevitable, and it's going to come. So as leaders, we have to definitely be ready to embrace that change. We have to be proactive and not reactive. And the more proactive we can be, the better prepared we are. We also have to understand that we have to look for the synergies beyond our situation, beyond technology. I've got to look at an enterprise level and say, okay, if we're prepared from a technology standpoint, the IT group is prepared, let's make sure that we look at the rest of the enterprise and see that those things that we rely on and that rely on us, that there's that relationship and that synergy there. Make sure there's a business continuity plan that's been updated. Make sure that your business process assessment is done and it's updated. And then those lessons learned are invaluable as well. What did we do well and we want to carry forward and we want to do again? What did we not do so well that we want to kind of throw out, almost in an agile fashion, like in those daily stand-ups or in that retro that you have when you're doing agile. So we want to keep those things that we're doing well. We want to make some changes and tweaks as necessary, and we want to make sure that we're looking beyond the micro level and on the macro level to look at our peers and our senior leadership team and say, hey, this is what we learned. What did you learn? And something Bruce said as well, talk to your peers outside of your group. There may be lessons that other organizations, it doesn't always have to be a special districts. It can be a private industry that found some lessons that can be applied to our situation. So you've always got to be ready to learn. You got to be a sponge and make sure that you're humble enough to realize that, hey, I could have done this better. We could have done this better as a group, and make those changes going forward.
Well said. Well, we have a question from the audience from an airport authority that has been hit relatively hard. And although they've been able to respond to the technology needs and refocusing priorities based on budget and PPE to staff, one thing that they've struggled with addressing is how to support employees working from home with children and family members that require care and, kind of require being the math teacher. I think, Brian, as you mentioned, with conference calls and text and Teams happening all hours of the day, this kind of raises the one of the points that we've heard across the country as well as, the overwhelming nature of now being virtual and having so many different points of interaction. Where are the lines, between your office and home now? And I'd love to get, Bruce and Brian, your thoughts on this, if anything comes to mind. Brian, maybe we'll start with you because this might be something you're dealing with in Atlanta.
Absolutely. So what we did talk about, like I said, we talked about being flexible. We've got to be flexible as leaders. We've got to understand. Again, it's easier for me. My kids are teenagers. One's off in college. But I definitely remember those days with younger kids. And you had some people that have some special needs children or medically fragile children. And that dynamic is just completely different. So as long as we're being sensitive to that, I think we can go back to the mantra where we said, be available, do your job, and over-communicate. That cannot be stressed enough. So now if I'm flexible as a manager, I have to understand that, hey, at 3 o'clock, it's nap time for your students or your kids or your kids/students, or you've got to go make a meal or something, then I don't have a problem with that. We can schedule our meetings accordingly. You can do what you need to do later that evening. If it helps you, we're more results-oriented. We're results-focused, and we're flexible, and we're completely understanding of that dynamic as long as we're over-communicating, and as long as we're doing our job, and as long as we're available as necessary, I think we'll get through this unprecedented time.
We're going to have to print those 3 things on a mug for you, that be available to over-communicate. I love it. So, Bruce, I know you've got a lot, too, that you could probably add to this from, kind of that communication and information standpoint, and really the role that plays in leadership. So any thoughts for our audience member here?
Yeah, well, so back to the communication, the leadership piece. So the leadership is kind of that planning piece that I talked about. So how are we going to deal with it? And you're right, in a virtual environment. I mean, Brian was spot on when he said we have to be more flexible. But I think besides that, I think we have to set a new level of expectations, right? And if anybody has trouble being a type A, I'm that individual, right? It's just, capital A, bolded, all special fonts. We have to understand that many of the people that work with us, many of our people that we interact with, do have those challenges. It's okay. It's okay if a child runs through the background of a Zoom meeting. It's okay if they have to mute themselves or if they have to stop the video for a few moments. It's okay if those things occur. I really do think that, actually, I've been on some meetings with individuals. I've got some grandchildren that are here occasionally, and I'll tell you, it actually injects a little bit of that levity. It takes a moment of the pressure and relieves it. When I talk about perspective, I think many of us, a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old toddler can actually do a lot to help the mental health of our individuals. It's okay, let it happen. Just, try to come up with some boundaries. You don't have to wear a shirt and tie every day. You don't have to do this. You can be in the fuzzy slippers. Relax.
Well said. Well, thank you, Brian and Bruce, so much for sharing your insights and perspective today. I know I took personally a lot away from the discussion. And now we're going to transition into our next panel on adapting your operations for a new reality. So we've talked about, how things have changed with COVID-19. We've talked about the future of leadership, And now we're going to dive into how districts are re-optimizing their internal operations. We've got John M. Donne, Director of Information Technology for the Emerald Coast Utilities Authority, and Gina Ellis Struther, the Chief Administrative Officer for the Charleston County Park and Recreation Commission. And Michael Harrod's back with us, Principal Architect for Shared Solutions for AT&T. And we have another question for the group around your greatest operational challenges. And I know that, you know, even Gary called out to everyone in the chat that workforce is one of their biggest challenges for employers. Existing staff has to be retained to work remotely without the face-to-face relationships. It kind of goes back to some of the discussion we had in our earlier panels. So tell us what your greatest challenges are. And as you respond to that, you know, Gina, Michael, John, thanks so much for joining us. And Michael, maybe let's start with you and kind of get a national perspective with how you're seeing special districts adapt their operations and services to this new reality.
It is. So as we had talked earlier about communications, about connecting remotely and finding ways for everybody to collaborate and communicate, one of the things that needs to be top of mind across all of these aspects are the security elements that go into play in that, and making sure that the services and connections and things that you're doing are secure, do have the proper DDoS protections or access list protections and content filtering protections as you would in your workplace. It's just as important. And even what is so frustrating now is there's so many bad actors out there today that are sending out email blasts and sending out malware and sending all of that and making employees aware of emails they should be clicking on and not clicking on. So I think security elements of that being in there, because we're being pulled in so many different ways as a home worker, is that you know, not allowing those malicious actors to disrupt not only what you're doing in your home environment, but what's happening within the corporate environment.
So now I want to kind of shift gears and talk a little bit from our special district leaders that are on here, kind of how their districts responded and you know, maybe re-optimized some of their operations in response to it. You can all see on the screen right now the greatest challenges that came from the audience. It looks like workforce policy and procedures, you know, enacting social distancing and all of those other things kind of came in, you know, at number one by a pretty large margin here. So John and Gina, let's start with you, John, on just how you've shifted your operations and your workforce in response to the events of 2020.
We had to respond rather quickly. You know, when the COVID thing came around the corner, we had a mini VPN solution that, you know, just IT people use when they get called at nighttime to log in and go fix something. And it wasn't really made for the entire workforce to use. And so, you know, we had to scramble and figure out a way how to get that done, you know, create groups and access lists. And then we go, well, how are we going to get people to use this? They've never used this before. They have no idea what we're talking about. A lot of people don't even know what a VPN is or what it means. And, you know, then we had to figure out how to distribute software to people who were going to use their home computers, because we didn't have enough laptops versus desktops. And so people were going to go use their home computers. And so we had to figure out a way how to deploy software to their home computer so they could install the VPN client, et cetera, et cetera. So we first created a portal where they could download software from. And then once the portal was created, and then we added instructions on how to do these things step by step. And then we also created an application portal for those users that just needed access to an app here or there, you know, our ERP system or employee directory or something that didn't need full-blown VPN access, to try to manage and you know, spread out the bandwidth needs. We had to bump up our bandwidth, for example. You know, we only had a couple of 100 megs to the internet, and it's all built on, you know, your network is built like this, everybody goes out. But now all of a sudden we had to flip it upside down. You got all these people coming back in, and it was a scramble. It was, I don't know, I have, you know, very limited IT staff, and we're, you know, brainstorming and whiteboarding and, you know, trying to find solutions to make it all work. And we got employees knocking on the door going, where's my computer that that I can take home to go work from home. We're like, what computer? What are you talking about? Oh my God, we're going to die. And so, yeah, it was a scramble. It was a big panic, fire drill. And, we got through it, and everybody was patient, and we kept saying, we're in this together. It's not you against me. It's not us against them. We're in this together. We have to figure out how to make this work. And, luckily people kind of calmed down and they realized that, everybody's doing their best. It's uncharted territory for everyone. And, now 6-7 months later, people click on stuff, they connect to the VPN, they don't give it a second thought anymore, and it's become like normal now. And so it's been very, very eye-opening and very, very tiring and frustrating for a lot, especially IT staff.
Absolutely. So Gina, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well, because I know, you're a slightly different type of district, but you had to re-engineer quite a bit here. So tell us a little bit about what you did.
Yeah, so we have a 11,000 acre park system spanning 100 miles, and we are in charge of many of the beaches, the water parks, historic sites, skate parks. And so when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we had to shut down our whole operation. Now, we living on the coastline, every year we deal with hurricanes and tropical storms. So the park system was accustomed to closing down, but not more than a week at a time. So when this happened, there was great uncertainty on exactly, well, how long is this really going to go on? So we decided most of our park staff work in the park. So they work on, many of the maintenance projects that were usually done off season, but our office staff many of them were equipped with their own laptops, company issued cell phones. But we did issue out loaner laptops and USB cameras and speakers for those that can all work remotely. But the problem lies in how do we communicate? How do we meet? Discuss things that are crucial to the operation. So we deployed the MS Teams application, which is very similar to Zoom. You can do video chats, you can share documents, store documents, as well as schedule meetings and even do some project management tools. So that was really crucial that we deploy that. We really were thinking of doing it almost a year later. It was on the schedule to deploy next year, but we didn't have time. We really had to get moving quickly. So that was one of the things that got us right on the path to connecting remotely and communicating remotely. And we have a fairly tech savvy staff, so we didn't encounter too many learning curves on that aspect of it, but it was just more about just kind of getting our operation in place for the unforeseeable future. We really didn't know how long it was going to take for anything to happen. So,
yeah, you had to lay that down. And Michael, I want to bring you back to this discussion here because, foundationally there are, a lot of key technologies. Gina talked about collaboration technologies like Teams that played a role here. What were some of the key technologies that you saw special districts use to kind of shift their operations and workforce remote? And, any challenges kind of in this rapid adaptation and adoption of technology?
It was, and we're on them right now, Zoom, right? Zoom, people had used Zoom. Some people have heard of Zoom. They've heard of WebEx. They've heard of Teams and GoToMeetings and all these other things. And some had experiences with them, others had no experiences with them or whatever. And it was quickly rolling out all of these collaboration tools for people to use, because that's the very first part of it. The very first part of it was getting people onto the network. How are we going to get them onto the network? And to his point, turn that V upside down because all the data is now coming back this way, coming back in. So it was rolling out the collaboration tools. As you know, at the beginning, there were a lot of issues across multiple collaboration tools with again, bad actors and people getting in there and understanding how to use it and allowing people in and not allowing them in and being disruptive. How do you control all of that? How do you get people used to being able to do that remotely? Because as we all know, 98% of us do not like looking at ourselves on video or those sorts of things, or actually hearing ourselves talk and all of that. So it's a whole new normal for everybody. But once you start doing it again, it just becomes natural. And to your point, and you touched on it, Dustin, not only from a business aspect that we're using all these collaboration tools, but from social networking to exercising, to cooking, to having the virtual Friday evening get-togethers, and all of those things, and how many families now are using all these collaboration tools to get back together. So the end of that was rolling out quickly millions upon millions upon millions of licenses across all of those collaboration tools, whether it be Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, go down the list.
So John, I know, in our earlier discussions, you mentioned that one of the biggest challenges that you faced was really centered around workforce training and support. You had that initial wave where you had to get everyone on, get them devices. How did you navigate that? And how did your workforce adapt to the new technology you used to aid their position? People that, were using laptops and other devices that never really had to before.
No, it was more involved than what we anticipated. We take using computers for granted as IT people. When somebody goes, oh, just plug it in the network, right? That's normal language to us. And so now you've got folks taking computers home, and they have wireless at home. They use their cell phone at home without a problem, but they don't have computers at home. So for somebody to take a computer home to go plug it into their home network, preferably wired, was something foreign. We'd get employees coming back like, oh, I need a 75-foot cable because, my router is over there and my PC is over here and I don't know how to connect to the wireless. And so there was all these, what I would call low-level things that we never anticipated, because in the office, we do that for them. We connect the computers, we get them on the network, we configure the printers, we make everything work, and then we just take that part for granted. And now when people had to go take their computers home, they had no idea how to do anything. People struggled with using a headset versus the computer speakers and a microphone and switching inputs, and it was mind-boggling to us. Oh man, people don't know how to do that? No, they don't. And so we just wrote tons of how-to documents, had to ask basic questions, more basic than what we normally do. Where are you? What computer are you using? How are you connected? These things that in the office, the answer to the questions because you know your customers. But when they're sitting at home, it's a whole different paradigm. So it was frustrating. It took a lot of extra patience. It took a lot of deep breaths and go, okay, back to the basics, way down to the beginning. What is the very first question? How are you connected? What computer are you using? Can you get on the internet? All these types of things. And it was a learning curve for everyone. And it just took patience and understanding from both sides. And but we worked through it, and eventually everybody got to do their jobs, customer service, answering 1,000 phone calls a day from their homes. And, our customers barely complained that they weren't getting their phones answered. So from a productivity perspective, it all ended up working out well, but it was a rough ride getting there.
Yeah, it sounds like you took a very people-centric, approach to making sure that you address the fundamental challenge at that, level. So Gina, I know that, you have leveraged the events of 2020 to also accelerate the push to paperless. And I'd love to get your perspective as to what you're thinking here and why it's so important for your district.
Yeah, so, as a park system, we're good stewards of the environment. And so we're always focused on reducing paper consumption to preserve the preservation of our forests and trees. And so we had a real big challenge when the pandemic hit because we were at the height of our hiring season for summer employees. And we have a task of hiring 800 people. And normally what that would involve is, 10 to 15 people coming to our offices to fill out paperwork for employment with us. Well, that could not happen. That whole operation was shut down. So one of the challenges that we had is, how do we onboard this staff? How do we onboard these employees in time for the high season, hoping that we would be able to open and conduct business? And so we did not have any money, no budget, nothing at all. And so we looked to use existing systems, one of them, which is the Tyler Munis system, which is primarily a financial system. And this system has some human resource capabilities, but we began to build all of the documentation, paperwork, everything uploaded into the system, allowing people emailing the hiring staff and asking them to go into the system, to log in, and start to fill out the paperwork online without any, not really paperwork, documentation, I should say, without any paper. Also, we use the Adobe Acrobat DC for people to sign documents online. That's free and it can be downloaded. And so we had to provide instructions on that. But we really could not operate with any face-to-face contact with anybody for the safety of the staff as well as the employees. And so, that was an extraordinary effort. We worked for 2 months to build the system using an existing system with no budget, testing it. We actually developed video trainings were conducted online using MS Teams, webinars, posters, all kinds of documents that we had stored online for people to access and utilize the system and their process. But we also had to get the general hiring staff trained on how to do that. So it was an extraordinary effort, people working days, nights, weekends to really deliver a solution in time for our hiring season. We're happy to say we were able to get through it. Obviously, there was always hiccups here and there, but we really were committed to making sure that that we had the staff ready for hire for the summer season.
That's an incredible story, and one that really validates the fact that even in a very constrained environment that's very uncertain, special districts can innovate and they can really triumph over this. So, applause to you and your team for that. So Michael, I want to get your perspective on this because one of the most neglected aspects, I think, of the conversation when it comes to working from home and the shift to remote is around cybersecurity. And, how should district leaders be thinking about, cybersecurity in this era of work from home?
No, exactly. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, is that it needs to be paramount. Because the last thing that you want to have happen is you go through all of these efforts, you go through all of these steps, you go through all of these challenges, and at the end of the day, a simple spam mail or something disrupts the entire organization in interruption. So cybersecurity needs to be top of that. It needs to be part of the front conversation of how we're rolling those things out. In John's case, they're utilizing VPNs, which are a good mechanism and secure. But on the back end of that, for the consumer side of it, if they're taking computers home, those computers will generally have the same security posture as what you had in the office because they came from those. But if the employees are using their home PCs, what are you doing to secure that security posture? What are you doing for separation of that and all of that? So the conversation needs to be upfront about cybersecurity, doing the basics of DDoS protection, of enterprise protecting, understanding, just doing simple training on understanding what spam mail looks like and how the bad actors get into the network through email. It looks like a very legitimate email, but it's as simple as just looking at the tagline in the email and looking at the address to see if that address looks normal to you, or is it outside of the country, or is it from Google or a university or whatever it is where you wouldn't think it'd be if it was going to be part of a government organization or a business organization. So it's just that it's fundamental training and understanding how to enable those security postures in the remote environment.
Yeah, great perspective. So we do have an audience question too from Wayne. And this one, I think is really applicable to Gina and John, related to employees that are using their home internet, maybe their own devices to access, your systems. Are you doing anything to pay employees for like a connectivity stipend or a phone stipend for leveraging kind of their at-home internet service or anything else? Gina, we'll start with you.
So we don't compensate the employees at this time related to internet access at home. Right now, we are on phase 1 of return to work. And that means that part of the time you're working at home and part of the time you can come to the office, and each employee can kind of decide along with their colleagues, what works best. So we do also have company issued cell phones, which have hotspots on it. So that does give an employee an option to use that internet connection while they're at home, although, that kind of connection, isn't as probably as reliable as, having Wi-Fi at the house. So right now we're not doing that. That's a good question. It's maybe something we need to consider. But right now we do have some tools in place. They do have the option to come into the office if they feel like that expense is something they're looking for us to reimburse.
John, how about for you?
So they didn't reimburse anybody for using their own personal systems. This came so fast out of the blue. Nobody had any budget for any of these kind of things anyway. And I think people were just happy to be able to work from home and, manage their kids not going to school. And I mean, we never got the question like, oh, I want some money for my internet because I'm helping the company. Nobody ever asked the question either. But it is a topic that's on the table as we discuss moving forward, with COVID, is it ever going to go away? Is it going to become something that we just learn to live with? And remote working is going to be something that's more prevalent than it is now. But it is on the table for discussion on would we, consider reimbursing people for using their personal stuff.
Also, if I may add, because people are working at home, they're not spending money on gas, on dry cleaning, eating out. So a lot of people did see some savings opportunities personally related to working in general by having the option to work at home.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gina. So in our final minutes, my final question for you three is just around, looking ahead to 2021, where are you at kind of on reopening? What are you planning for in 2021? And, for you, Michael, I think maybe, kind of what are some of the key trends or things that leaders should be thinking about? Michael, let's start with you and then we'll go to Gina and John.
Yeah, no, I think Gina touched on it. What is their opening strategy? What are they going to do? What are the steps being taken? What are those elements that you could do in-house that you can do offline? So all of that. And again, I think it continues that conversation of collaboration, understanding what are the needs of the business, what is the best way to be able to understand that. And it's going to be a slow migration, I think, back to the office environment, and it allows organizations to, again, relook at their business model to understand, what does essential mean for in the office? What does that look like and what does that mean?
Gina, how about for you?
So, in this time where there's restrictions and uncertainty, I think we've emerged with, demonstrating great resilience, innovation, creativity. We've sort of stepped off the autopilot mode and really are fully engaged in the business that we're doing, and we're discovering and, surprising ourselves that, hey, we've made it through. We really did come through. And, when I think about the parks, it's become more visited than before because people see it as a place to relax, to get away. It's open space. You can practice social distancing very easily. It's just emerged. The value of our park system has just become that much more important for our community because they see it as a place to distress and heal. And I feel like that we're putting the gas on the pedal. We're moving forward. We're talking about other technology that we can use. And I think that we'll all be better for it.
And John, final word is with you.
Well, during the last 5 years or so at ECOA, we've been working towards modernizing IT infrastructure, putting in an ERP system, going paperless, doing all these things. And the COVID paradigm just solidified that we were on the right path. The transition to working from home and all these things from a business perspective, it didn't really change that much. Right. And it also didn't really cost us any substantial monies because we were already headed in that direction. Nobody knew that it was applicable to a COVID situation. And so it was easy to kind of flip that over. And, I hope that we learn that, we can adapt, we can adjust. We've got to learn, we've got to listen, we've got to be proactive, we got to think smart, and people are learning that, work from home doesn't need to be surrounded by air quotes, right? It's a real thing. People can actually work from home. They can be productive, use technology, and, life goes on and we'll keep on going and we'll keep moving forward. And, we just got hit by a hurricane. We came through that. There's another couple lining up in the Gulf ready to hit us face it on. So we just keep going and keep, rolling with the punches.
Well said. Well, John, Gina, and Michael, thanks so much for joining us for the discussion and sharing your insights. Now we're going to transition into our last panel of the day, which is around reimagining your special district experience. The experience of special districts is so critical when you think about, the response to COVID-19. The digital experience that these special districts had was a very vital part of that response. And joining us today are Yvonne Carney, the Strategic Performance Director of Strategy and Innovation for Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, or WWSC. Michael Harrod is going to be joining us again, Principal Architect of Shared Solutions for AT&T. And then this panel will actually be moderated by one of my colleagues, Steve Towns, our Deputy Chief Content Officer at eRepublik, the parent company of Government Technology Magazine. And we do have one more poll question for you here around how your district responded from an experience standpoint with technology. What did your district deploy in 2020? Did you put up a new website, maybe new internet connectivity upgrades, new online services, new training programs, any social media channels that you have, 311 call center updates? So we'll give you a moment to answer that. And while you're doing that, we also had a great feedback from Gary Solsky, who mentioned that IT training is so useful for everyone, even if you're not in IT. So in the chat that he put to everyone there, you've got an opportunity to look at some resources and some learnings from Gary and his special district. And so let's take a look at how you all responded from an experience standpoint. All right, it looks like new digital policy procedures and governance, definitely digital board meetings, those types of things, followed by internet connectivity upgrades. So some really fascinating insights here. And with that, Steve, I will hand the floor to you.
Well, thanks, Dustin. It's nice to be here. And Yvonne and Michael, it's great to talk to you guys. Thanks for spending some time with us. I think it's a really fascinating topic, the way you interact with your employees and customers, and the experience you provide is evolving so much, and has really been amplified by the COVID experience around virtual and digital services. So appreciate you guys chatting with us. Yvonne, I thought really my first question is, I'm intrigued with your title, Strategic Performance Director for Strategy and Innovation. Can you talk a little bit about your role and what that entails on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So at WSSC Water, our vision is to be a world-class utility, and we strive to. The Environmental Protection Agency has a best practice guidance around effective utility management. So strategic management, using data to drive decisions, is all a part of that. And so I help to support our senior leadership team to build, to refine, and to execute on their strategic plan, which of course, we do have to revisit that in light of COVID, and have been doing that. And so on the data front and risk analysis front, on a day-to-day basis, we're kind of helping to support our senior leaders to provide them information as they're making big, important decisions. So that could be about refining a project, or identifying, we're seeing some data that, identifies maybe we need to be doing more in a certain area. In COVID, that has been, all of the data has really been at the forefront. I mean, we see that just in general, right? We're looking to data on public health. And so it's, certainly been the same for us during COVID. So, my role is just helping to support analysts in various departments that are trying to gather information. So, kind of helping with both the access to data, how do you interpret it, how do you present it in a way that really helps our leadership and our decision makers make the best possible decisions for our customers.
Yeah, really interesting spot to be in. And I think, certainly of growing importance around data as we, as everyone tries to move to a more data-driven kind of position. Michael, let me pull you into the discussion as well. I mean, you're watching districts kind of throughout the nation deploy new technologies to reach their citizens and employees better. Are you seeing some standout examples of districts that have optimized the experience they provide to users?
I'm amazed at the creativity and the ability for these organizations to pivot very quickly to meet their demands. Gina's example of doing hiring for part-time workers in the parks and creating, with in-house apps to be able to do that, and the training elements and all of that. So it's just amazing how all, the collaboration at the end of the day, it was about the collaboration, both in-house and remotely, of coming together, understanding the problems that they had to solve for, figuring out those with either little or no budget to be able to make that happen, and then moving them forward. And what will be really interesting is that those solutions that they created will be mainstream solutions, and they'll be built upon, and they'll be expanded and moved it even further, moving into the future for those services. And Yvonne, you're absolutely right. It's about data, right? It's about understanding that data, what it's all about, because the data establishes what your constituency are, where your issues are, what the problem to resolve is, and how to resolve those problems. So I'm just amazed at the ingenuity that everybody has shown during this whole crazy time, right?
Yvonne, you mentioned, some of your, or at least started to touch on your work with data. Do you want to talk about sort of the power of performance metrics and how your organization is using data to respond to COVID, and then ultimately maybe to provide a better customer experience overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with COVID, there are so many unknowns, and we've faced them and looked to data where we can to get some sense of knowns. And so our emergency management team, led by our director, has really just shown bright in this area of using data to give us a picture of where we are, what's the landscape. So we have, and our leadership was discussed already, but we have a kind of a structure that allows us to come together weekly. That starts with a review of data and what's the landscape, what's happening, and that is primarily public health data. But as a water utility, we're part of that water that public health infrastructure, because it's so important that customers be able to wash their hands to stay safe, along with many other strategies, right? So we've seen that data be front and center in decision making about our customer services, and really making sure that we're continuing to meet our core mission. And so as part of that meeting, you're seeing not the public health data, but also our operational metrics. And so I think it was good that we had this reporting in place, and we're able to leverage it to provide that check and be able to monitor that yes, we are providing water to our customers. We're answering their, as they're calling our call center, we're able to answer their questions in a timely manner. And I think it also is helping us in things that we, didn't expect. So, as a water utility, we're not shutting off water. And so, because that is so important right now. We also know our customers are really impacted financially, and some of our customers are struggling to pay their bills. So that is looking at that, financial data is important for us to be really focusing our customer strategies, which right now are really around, can we get our customers on payment plans? Do we have affordability programs? And so that too has led to, what kind of policies do we want to suggest to our policymakers? So I think there's also the aspect of unifying, that this data just can help everybody throughout the organization be on the same page.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's that mix of really public health data, operational data, financial data that's giving you, I guess, a kind of a broader picture of what's going on, so you can make decisions based on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dave, or I'm sorry, Michael, you've you've been watching this nationally. You want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing, kind of across special districts around using data, either in this way or other innovative ways to operate in a more data-driven fashion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when we look at AT&T, data is very important to us because it allows us to be able to respond to what's going on within our network infrastructure, both in the wireline arena and the mobility arena. And we talked about the V shape with the data going out and then coming back in. And the same is holding true, where we look at corporate data on traditional transport services, that has gone way down. But then when we look at all of our internet services and our mobility services, it's skyrocketed, right? The best example is putting out MiFis to all of the school districts to be able to get students onto the internet. And we've deployed millions upon millions of those. So taking that internet access out of those school districts and off of those and putting onto our mobility services. But how we're seeing that impact is being able to then respond to the needs of our customers within our infrastructure to be able to provide that. Throwing billions of dollars into 5G infrastructure. 5G is, everybody hears about 5G today. What is the real purpose of 5G and what does it really mean to us specifically when it comes to data? Data provides three elements when we talk about business. It provides many, many devices on the network, it provides high bandwidth speed, and it provides quality of service or low latency that goes into it, which is critical for a lot of business needs. So all of that data allows us to look at that and then respond accordingly to what our customer needs are.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Michael, if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the things that we've heard certainly from special districts is, COVID has kind of accelerated transformation and modernization, in interesting ways. It sounds like that's also the case at AT&T, right? I mean, you've had to respond, to massive new demand kind of nationally, which has both, somewhat changed priorities, but also accelerated the pace of change itself.
Well, yeah, like every industry, it's changed the priorities of where we're putting infrastructure in at, and the rollout of 5G is actually enhanced with providing that because it allows us to get that faster speed out there. Though LTE speed is okay, it's decent. But at the end of the day, to be really efficient and be able to do what you're going to do on wired infrastructure, that's where 5G really shines. And it's really pushed all of the telecoms and all of the carriers and that to roll out much, I think, speed up their rollout schedules of what they were doing. And then it also has the company looking at, where is our capital funding being spent in relationship to our networks and all that sort of thing, and being able to respond to it. And then when you throw in not only the COVID element of that, then we look at what's going on with all of the natural disasters, the fires out west, the hurricanes in the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, and the flooding and all of those sorts of things. And with the technology and the data that we have the ability to re-roll out mobility services with that 5G and LTE infrastructure much quicker today than we were in the past, based upon that, because we have all of this infrared element pre-deployed and pre-staged and ready to go, where before it was we weren't able to respond as quickly. Today we're able to respond much more quickly and get those services back up and operational.
Yeah. Yvonne, speaking of change and shifting priorities, you mentioned your strategic plan. Can you talk a little bit about that plan and how, events of this year maybe have shifted the thinking or planning around kind of strategy going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So we purposely re-looked at our strategic plan and with a focus on, you know, how will COVID impact this plan? And so our senior leaders reviewed it, we met, and some of the things that came out of that were, you know, adaptation and looking at, you know, what do we do to adjust to this new normal. And so, for example, we've had a subcommittee of employees that have been very focused on this topic and have come forth with a series of recommendations, which I anticipate would become part of our plan. But things like, let's relook at our telework policies. Can we move to paperless? Can we automate processes? Open data, can we do more of that? So all of these things, I think, are things that we will be moving towards and incorporating in our plan. I think, too, it's also just been, COVID has illustrated the importance of planning. We've certainly seen that with emergency management. They are, you know, always thinking about potential scenarios in the future. And so and we actually had a potential scenario being a pandemic. And so sort of the organizational structure for managing this prolonged incident, we've benefited from that advanced planning. And so, of course, that kind of planning can be happening, you know, across the organization as well. So I think it's just reinforced the need for planning. I will say as well, part of our plan is a strategic plan is to develop a digital strategy. I think that when that was first on the strategic plan, people maybe were like, why do we need that? And so now everyone is really clear why we need that, why that's so important.
Yeah. Kind of speaking of digital strategy, Yvonne, are you seeing customer expectations shifting? Are they demanding more data, more access? Kind of what does that look like? You know, whether it's, I think probably some of that's COVID driven, some of that's happening already, but how are those expectations shifting?
Absolutely, yeah. So we look at customer satisfaction surveys to kind of get a sense of what customers are expecting of us. And I think, as is the case with, you know, all of us in our personal lives, we have so much access to data. We can log in, we have apps, we can log in, you know, in the utility world, you can see your, you know, your energy usage. Maybe you even get a notification that tells you it's a high energy day. So in the water utility world, those are all things that we could be doing as well. So I think that, you know, the expectations are sort of, our customers are kind of expecting the same thing they're getting from their other services. So, you know, in other aspects of our business, that could be when they're making a phone call to us traditionally about their bill, maybe also providing things like chat functionality would start to meet those expectations that they have of all of the other companies they interact with.
Yeah, Michael, let me ask you the same question. I mean, how are you guys seeing customer expectations shift, and what does that mean to the districts you support?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's the reliance on being able to have access to your applications and services and being able to provide that same level or greater level of service to your customers, especially in special districts, because they cover all of the elements that are critical for life, health, and safety today. You talk about infrastructure, you talk about water, sewer, you talk about, you know, all of those elements. So having them be able to provide that same or greater level of experience to the customer is paramount.
Yeah. Yvonne, you guys have done some interesting things. When we chatted earlier, you mentioned some of the changes you're making around meter reading in homes. I know you have some instances where your customers have meters located within their homes. Obviously, in the COVID environment, you maybe didn't have physical access to those meters anymore. Tell us how you handled that.
Yeah, so about 4% of our customers have meters that are inside the house and do not have any remote access. So we are not able to read it from outside the home. So the downside of, well, our action, of course, to keep our customers and our employees safe was to no longer go into customers' homes, which is what we used to do. And so that's really important for safety. The downside for our customers is that if we don't receive that meter read, then we're estimating, and we could be estimating too high. And customers, we don't want that for our customers, especially with the financial concerns and realities that our customers are facing with unemployment. And so what we did to mitigate that was to stand up a program, a project, working in partnership with our customer service department and our IT department to stand up a portal on our website that enabled customers to enter their own meter reads. And this was done very quickly within a matter of months. And we're connecting that with our billing system so we can have some checks on that to make sure it's within the range of normal. But that has just been a way that we can, and it's been accompanied by videos that our maintenance staff have put together to help customers understand, what are you looking at on that meter panel? So I just think it's been a really great example of, having a challenge, wanting to keep everyone safe, having a operational challenge, and meeting that challenge with creativity and collaboration.
Yeah, kind of speaking of creativity, I know you guys are the regulatory body for plumbing and gas. Talk about how you shifted inspections and oversight to virtual there, which I thought was also interesting.
Yes, and I think I heard another example as well earlier of this too. So we provide inspections for residential and commercial customers, and of course, same situation. We don't want to go face to face in order to make sure everyone stays safe. So our regulatory services division just was incredibly creative and came up with a way to do these inspections virtually. So using the collaboration technologies that we use for our meetings, the inspectors are offsite in their homes, staying safe. And giving, basically they become sort of videographers, instructing the plumber where to put the camera so that they can visually confirm that things are done correctly. And they also, regulatory services also came up with a way to create a virtual sticker that would indicate that this inspection took place. So it's now accounting for 46% of our inspections are being done virtually.
That's really interesting. Do you see that sticking around? I mean, it sounds like it's working okay. Is that something you keep post-COVID, or whatever the new environment looks like?
Yes. I spoke with the manager of this department to talk with her about this, and she said, absolutely, it's another tool that they didn't have before. So I think definitely for days where we have bad weather days or bad traffic days that would somehow impede us, I think definitely will be used on those days, but and I think will also be used as well. Maybe not 46% of all of them, but certainly will continue to be used.
Yeah, really cool. In our last couple of minutes, let's look toward the future a little bit. Michael, what experiential technologies are on your radar for the future, and maybe what should this audience, be thinking about as we look toward the future of the experience for both, internal and external customers?
Absolutely, and I touched on that earlier, and that's 5G technology.
Yeah.
5G is really going to change the dynamics of being able to interoperate across not only mobile devices, smartphones, but in the Wi-Fi world in general. Just because of the services that it provides inherently to it. And again, I touched on the three major ones: massive device connectivity, bandwidth speed, low latency, and that the low latency really comes into play. And we're really going to see this with autonomous vehicles and all of those sorts of things. In today's world with LTE and 4G and those services, the latency for the information to get back and forth to each other just isn't there. So you can't put the onus on autonomous vehicle or other types of application, robots and services and delivery services and all of those things. 5G will be the game changer for that.
Yeah. Yvonne, what do you see for 2021 and beyond? I know you have, we chatted a little bit about a potential open data initiative. Maybe you could tell us a little bit on what's on the horizon and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So during this COVID pandemic, we've been internally consuming a lot of open data, our state, our county, Johns Hopkins. And so the ease of being able to access that data has really it's just a game changer to have public APIs that allow you to access it, to immediately have it as part of your dashboard for management. And so we know there's a lot of potential there for being able to provide that kind of information about our operations to our customers. And we certainly see a lot of examples of that in municipal government, having open data sets about all kinds of things about services being provided and how that's being leveraged by customers and by researchers, innovators. And so we are looking to do something similar for our water utility. And then another piece I just would touch on would just be really trying to leverage as we're making investments in technology, to really leverage those to make them as seamless as possible to the customer. So, kind of improving the processes so that we make things fast and easy for our customers.
Yeah, maybe one last thought too. I mean, we talked a little bit about internal experience for employees. Do you have a take on what the future looks like? Some of our earlier panelists talked about that return to work. I mean, for you guys, as much as you know, kind of what does work look like? Sort of off into the future. Is it all in office? Is it hybrid? Is it virtual? Do we have the answers yet?
I think there will certainly be more working from home for sure. Prior to this, we had, I think, a policy that allowed maybe one day a week. That will certainly change. I don't know what the right balance will be. I mean, of course, we have a workforce that's half of our workforce is in the field, producing our water and maintaining our infrastructure, engaging with customers directly. So that will always be the case, and we have to make sure those employees stay safe. But our other half of our workforce, it has been working remotely. So I think it's still to be seen, like what that balance will be. But I think it's been demonstrated that it's working, that we're getting our work done. And so we'll see what the future holds.
Really interesting. Yvonne, thanks for spending some time with us. And Michael, too, it was a pleasure talking to both of you. Dustin, I will hand the conversation back to you.
Thanks, Steve.
You guys.
Great panel. Well, we're nearing the end of our event, but we do have time for one more brief section as we dive into exploring what is next. And we do have one last poll question for you around what you're tracking and what you're experimenting with that others might take note of. So share what you're doing there. We'd love to see what you're doing and how you're responding. And what we're going to do in this next section is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our research and what's around the corner and what you should be looking at inside of your district and some of the key technologies that are out there as a part of that. So special districts have taken on a variety of new roles in response to the events of 2020. They have to do a lot of different things all simultaneously. They're designers, they're enforcers, they're communicators, they're policymakers, they're employers, service providers, communicators, all of these different dynamics all at the same time. And as we heard today, the expectations from the public are also greater than ever for these districts. We saw tremendous response, especially back, in March and April from districts, and now people have greater expectations for special district leaders and how they coordinate response, not just in a pandemic, but now for everything. And so the bar has been raised, and there's a lot of new things that are coming at us. So let's take a little look at how you responded and what you're seeing around the corner. So it looks like drones, there's definitely some experimentation there, personalized information delivery, chatbots, AI, we got a little bit of 5G stuff happening there. So thanks for sharing what you're doing and how you're responding. And now let's talk a little bit about the future. So we kind of divided this section into a series of different kind of subcomponents. We call these macro trends. These are big things that are going to impact everything that special districts are doing from an operational standpoint, and they're not all technology related. So diving into our first one, the pace of change and new expectations are exponentially accelerating. So what we saw this year, you often heard the quote that, we did 3 years worth of work in 3 months. And that is a new pace of change. We call that an exponential pace of change. And in fact, some of the behavioral changes that have happened with our employers, with our employees, with our districts, and the people that we serve, those were on a doubly exponential scale, meaning that things were happening so quickly that now, there's certain things that are irrelevant. I mean, now you've got virtual board meetings, that may be a new norm. There were a lot of questions around, are we going to go back to a physical building? What are we going to do with our physical buildings? I mean, we definitely see a hybrid approach emerging here, but the fact of the matter is the pace of change is now accelerated to the point where districts can no longer sit on the sidelines. They have to really look at being proactive. As I mentioned before, the expectations are higher, and so we have to look for ways to leverage technology, some of these disruptive changes with the processes themselves, and really tap into kind of our employees and our citizen base to figure out better ways of doing things. We saw a lot of innovation there. Now, many of you responded to our poll saying you're experimenting with personalized information delivery, and that's great. And basically, the trend here is that, the website used to be the front door of government. It used to be the front door of special districts. And this is no longer the case. The website plays an important role, but now it's about personalizing the information that you provide. I kind of equate the traditional website to Yahoo's homepage from over a decade ago, right? You had every possible thing that you could imagine all available. You just had to find it. You had to, know how to know where the groupings were and know what to click on. Now we're seeing a lot of districts focusing on how do I take information to the right people at the right time with the right context, so that way I'm bringing that to them. If someone's past due on their water bill, maybe that's what they want to see when they go to your website. Maybe I can nudge them with a text message. Maybe I can do something that actually goes to where they're at. So personalized information delivery is going to be increasingly vital. We're also seeing the rise of feedback loops as an important aspect of how we design future services. So today's theme kind of to me was that, having a people-centric approach is really vital to navigate change and to deal with some of the other dynamics that go along with it internally and externally. And feedback loops play into that. And right now, if you want to sign up for a new service or sign up for a new account at your library, you fill out a form, right? What if you were able to provide real-time information back as a real-time feedback loop? Maybe I'm filling out a form and I actually don't live in the service area for that district. Maybe that form can dynamically tell me, hey, you don't live here, but here is the proper form that you can fill out in order to get your services turned on. This is designing for the people. And the benefit isn't just for that end user that is actually completing that process. The benefit is actually for the agency that doesn't have to go through a whole cycle looking at someone's request for new service or whatever it might be, just to find out that they're not actually eligible based on where they live or based on a variety of other factors that may play into that. And so there's a lot of new ways to think about the role data plays here, behavior-based goals, designing for people and the behaviors of these individuals and trying to find ways to really build, accessible services that serve the vast majority of the population are key. Now, we also know that communication and connectivity is going to play a really crucial role here. I mean, this was the top policy priority in state and local government. And it's also something in special districts that plays a really important role in how we provide services and, how we think about, reimagining libraries and reimagining park districts and all of these different types of entities. It all comes down to connectivity and finding ways to take services that we would normally do in person and make them accessible. And by the end of the decade, we anticipate that we'll kind of reach this point of zero latency. Basically, we'll have about a terabyte per second available at your at-home internet connection, which would allow you to download all 238 episodes of Friends in 1 second. And outside of binge watching that, it's going to enable all kinds of new use cases around self-driving cars and a variety of new things that district leaders are going to have to pay attention to. Now, we know that digital and innovation ecosystems are going to be really important here. And we heard a lot about that in task force, work groups, other things. These are all ecosystems that are not just made up of special district leaders and employees, but it's also finding people that you serve, businesses, academia, nonprofits, NGOs, a variety of organizations that can work together, kind of like what happened in response to the initial pandemic. We saw, great collaboration and coordination across multiple geographic boundaries and also multiple levels of government, and even including non-governmental entities. So this is going to be an important way of keeping up with the future. And it's all kind of, going to this special districts as a service, which is where people, are treating special districts not as just a website or not as just a physical place that I go to get something done, but as something that solves a problem, as something that provides a service. And so there's going to be a lot of innovation around technology and new processes that deal with just that find ways to make special district services more accessible to people where they are. And in-person is not going to go away completely. That's still going to be an important dynamic, but we have to find ways to do that safely and effectively for them. So how do you keep up and kind of how do you manage all of the craziness of the change? Well, a lot of our panels dove into that today, and we had a lot of great insights around, communication and collaboration and, being flexible. But, first, you also need to understand kind of the bigger trends that are out there. What are your customer needs? What are the macro trends around them? And then you want to look at, making a place, codifying a group that allows you to keep up with these changes. And it doesn't mean that you have to have your entire executive board on it. It could just be, your cubicle bay or something else. You're going to find ways to have a regular conversation about what's happening and track on that and find ways to test and adapt. You also want to look at engaging partners. You want to look at engaging, companies and finding different ways to tap into the expertise of the people that you serve and leverage that in the process. And then you want to lay a foundation for rapid adaptation. So we're going to have to move quicker than ever, which means that we can't be worried about security and other things like we have in the past. So we have to partner with organizations. We have to find ways to, have more nimble policy and more flexible policy. And then we have to be able to measure and analyze all of this. And so I think that's another important aspect of this is, being able to track what we're doing and knowing that it's effective and that we're able to keep up with change and learning from that. So those measurement dynamics are going to be critical. And so that brings us to the end of today. And, I just want to thank you all for spending time with us and kind of joining us for today's discussion. I do want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to have to begin our wrap up here. And we've covered so much ground in our Special District Summit, from discussing what we learned from special district leaders to how they navigated and responded to COVID-19, to exploring the future of the special district experience and even exploring what comes next. And, I personally feel more inspired than ever about how special districts are adapting to change. They're innovating through it. They're triumphing over it. So special thank you goes out to all the special district leaders and our industry partners at AT&T that were able to join us and share their insights on today's summit. And I'd also like to thank our Special Districts National Advisory Board for their insights, guidance, and help in helping frame the topics that we talked about today. Now, before we adjourn, I did want to share one other opportunity that you'll have to engage with our program before the end of this year. We're actually going to do a special summit on response and recovery. This will be a virtual event where we take insights from over 270 different best practices that were identified nationally across the country, and we're going to recognize them. We're going to talk about what's happening and how district leaders navigated through uncertainty and triumphed over it. So if you'd like to join us and have us automatically register you for that, we can do so. Just answer yes on the poll question there. We'll make sure you're on the list and you'll get further information from us. And I just want to take this moment also to thank you, our audience, for carving time out of your schedule to join today's summit. We hope you've been inspired by what you've heard, and we can't wait to see what you do with all of this information and what's next. And lastly, I just want to thank our partners at AT&T, because without their support, today's conversation would not have been possible. Partnership plays such a critical role in adapting and thriving in disruptive periods of change. And we thank AT&T for being such a vital partner for special districts during this time. We'll be following up in the coming days with a link to today's event and with some slides. So that way you can take kind of all the slides that we talked about today and share them with your colleagues, share them with your network. And we can't wait to see you next. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to also see you in person next year. But thanks so much for joining us for our Special District Summit East. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.